This is a production of Cornell University.
I want to give a warm welcome to everyone this morning. We are fortunate to have at today's workshop on the future of the social sciences a distinguished gathering of participants, including not only the presenters, but also other leading social scientists and university administrators. Indeed, any discussion of the future of the social sciences needs to include not only leading social scientists, but also administrators who plan the development of these fields. Administrators are involved not only in strategic planning with regard to the next generation of social science faculty, but in facilitating through institutional innovation the cross-disciplinary exchange and cooperation that have enabled significant advances in the natural sciences, as, for instance, between physicists, chemists, and biologists in the recent advances in biology. Likewise, a discussion of the future of the social sciences should involve the leaders of the major foundations. It is increasingly clear that the National Science Foundation lacks the capability and the institutional support from Congress to provide the funding we need to pioneer the path-breaking research that is needed by the social sciences in the 21st century. Thus, we will need to rely on other sources for funding. The generosity and commitment of major foundations will be crucial. The first Future of the Social Science Conference was organized by Doug North at Washington University in St. Louis in 2004. The second was convened in 2006 by Barnaby, Marsh, and myself, and I can see today there are 6 participants that were there at the 2006 meeting. Doug North wasn't able to come to this meeting, but he sends his best wishes. At the end of this workshop today, we will ask you whether there is interest in seeking foundation support for regular meetings like today's to institute an ongoing discussion of the future of the social sciences. Some of the most significant advances in the social sciences have occurred during periods of open cross-disciplinary exchange, as with the behavioral revolution in the 1960s, the new institutionalism in the 1990s, and also with recent advances in network and computational social sciences. Perhaps it is time to set up a cross-disciplinary meeting place where we could repeatedly bring together leading social scientists, university administrators, and leaders of foundations, thus influencing through our ongoing discussion of the future of the social sciences. The way we will work today is that we have 4 panels, and Todd Bridges sitting there will be the timekeeper. And with each of the presentations, we hope you have 15 to 20 minutes and to make the presentation. And then after the panelists have made the presentations, we'll have open discussion as we move forward. And I'm pleased to, the first panel will be on the big questions that face us in the 21st century. And I'm pleased to introduce Barnaby Marsh as the first presenter in the panel with Russell Hardin and Duncan Watts in that order. Barnaby is the Senior Vice President of the John Templeton Foundation, which has been playing an increasingly important role in funding the social sciences. Barnaby?
Sure, thanks Victor, and welcome to everyone. I'm going to stand and give a few remarks right now, and then I'll probably be sitting for my presentation so we can have a discussion. But in my remarks, in addition to welcoming people from so many different backgrounds and perspectives, I also want to say a little bit, just as an introduction before I give my presentation, which is how I'm seeing a lot of the work in the social sciences from the point of view of increasingly sort of an outsider, someone at a foundation who, in addition to doing a lot of administration, directly meets with people who are geneticists and physicists and mathematicians and biologists, and people from the social sciences as well, psychologists, sociologists, political scientists, and so forth. And so as a result of that, my own view of the social sciences relative to the other sciences has really been enlarging over the last few years. And in that process, I've really come to see the growing importance of different disciplines working together and gatherings such as this, where people can put different ideas out there on the table and have them viewed through the lenses of others who might be working in different fields. We're especially grateful that you've all made time for this conference. We know that these types of conferences are expensive in terms of time and often don't lead to short-term outputs in terms of new papers and so forth. However, we do believe that the possibility for the introduction of ideas that are unfamiliar or new can have profound longer-term effects. And so that's our hope here, is that the discussions that we have here can help set the stage for broader trajectories and broader amplifications of your work, both within your field and across fields. So with that, I'm going to try, I don't know what the microphone setup is here. I'm going to try to set the tone of being more in the center of the room here so that others who follow, we might have more of a collective discussion, informal atmosphere, which I think will work better. But we'll give this a try, but if it doesn't work, I'll come back up here. So I'm not sure how long these cords are. Okay. There we are. So when I look at the what we think of as the big questions in the social sciences, this is very much in tune with the work I currently do at the foundation I work for, the John Templeton Foundation. One of our themes is big questions across the different sciences and social sciences and philosophy and other areas. Because the hope is really to generate the notion of longer-term visions and how well, in our own more specialized work, we're addressing those longer-term visions. And so when I look at what I think are some of the big questions in the social sciences, they seem to cluster into certain types of groups. One group is around individuals and individuality. And the history of studies in those areas by psychologists and sociologists and others revolve around sort of very fundamental problems that, in my opinion, we've seen some very interesting work, but there's clearly still a lot of discovery to happen and a lot of theory that still needs to be developed. For instance, the development of individual tastes and preferences, where they come from, how they're constructed, what the dynamics of those look like under different conditions. Another example that I think is fascinating is how people come to form their beliefs and the strength of those beliefs. People die for their beliefs in some cases. So, how do we really explain that in a rational way? I don't think that some of the economic models or even some of the philosophical work out there really gives a complete picture of the variation you see between individuals in how beliefs are formed and to what extent they stay fixed or vary. Another one is the construction of identity, both by others but also internally, by oneself. How one comes to believe what's possible for them and how that affects their life course and their interactions with others and their potentials. Huge possibilities there and implications for education and a whole range of different areas. And then some of the areas that we work on at Templeton are around desire, what we decide to consume, and notions of what it means to be happy. We're seeing more scientific type work in this area, but it's still, it's very rudimentary in terms of having robust measures, clarity in terms of definitions, and also the work that should happen eventually around the dynamics of these different features still looks like, to me, like it's in its infancy. And I actually am aware, I read the primary literature in many of these areas regularly, and I'm aware that there is a lot of detailed, specific work. But when I try to step back and I look at these problems from the point of view of the big questions and how well we're advancing, from where I sit, it looks like we have a ways to go, and so that's encouraging. Likewise, there are a lot of questions around emergence, this kind of stuff like, how do you get a mind from a collection of neurons, or in a social setting, how different groups of people and their values and their aims aggregate to become, the society that we live in and the culture that we live in. I think there's a lot of room there for new work and new discovery. How we define culture. What that actually is. We're a lot of great work. I read it all the time, but still the underlying theory of culture, the theoretical underpinnings seem to me to be still somewhat underdeveloped. This question about the aggregation of knowledge. So every year we're collecting more and more knowledge. It's hugely expanding. But the question is, does that mean that we're necessarily wiser? Do we have value systems that reflect increased knowledge, or do those things just sort of happen? I think those are open questions. And then really at the core of all this is the human potentials to be creative, imaginative, and to make progress. Even that is difficult. We just launched a new institute on the human imagination and the scientific study of the human imagination, and I have to say that the work out there is very spotty. It's very well developed in some areas, and in other areas there's practically a non-existent literature if you go to look for it. So why should that be? And I think that the answer is that it's the time for the social scientists to advance in those areas some more, and I think that's going to be happening, as I'll be saying in a few minutes. Finally, this issue of institutions and how our cultures and the institutions in our culture help to address societal problems in different ways, solve societal problems in different ways. So we've been working on issues of race, class, and gender for some time now. I think there's there's been a lot of progress there, but still it seems that institutional structures could develop further to address some of those things. Things around institutional structures for schools. A lot of them are kind of, in some ways, stuck in a different time. They're stuck in a time that was set up for the Industrial Revolution, for training certain types of workers, and there's a lot of talk about how schools can change to educate people in today's world. Traditional workplaces, likewise, and then the ever relevant question of efficiency in government and the role of government to play a proactive role in our society. And I put this out there as a little bit more as to how we can all be healthier. So the the science, the medical science around being healthy is sort of there, but how do you actually convince people to exercise and to eat well and have good work-life balance, all those sorts of things, sort of to me seem to be sort of beyond the biology itself and come more over into the social sciences. So how can we make inroads there? The good thing is that we can make reasonably well-informed inferences about the future in the social sciences area based on the development of other fields. So many of the more mature natural sciences have gone through a certain pattern, and there's no reason to think that in the social sciences you wouldn't see a similar sort of evolution from the descriptive towards the more theoretical. And I actually think we're seeing that increasingly in the social sciences over the last 30 years or so, and it's accelerating. So I do think we're entering an exciting time for the social sciences, because we have now have a lot more information that allows better measures, better tests of ideas, and allows for the communication of concepts that's less subjective, perhaps. And this has been noticed by different people. I've put up a few examples here of scholarship in the change area that's well known. I mean, Tom Kuhn's work on the model of structure of scientific revolution is really well known, of course. And then Ivan R. Cohen's work, which is less well known but very, very erudite, maps through the different fields how these processes happen. And there's a consistent pattern there, and it really looks like within the social sciences, probably for the first time, we're beginning to have ingredients that will allow transitions into a zone where there can be better integration and theoretical development in terms of data and information. Certainly, if we look out into the world, the collection of data and information from individual behavior, real behavior out there, like how people buy things now with credit cards. I was talking to my brother on the weekend. He just started at MasterCard, looking at their data collection and their studies of human behavior in the context of card usage. And a huge amount of information, as you're all aware, is now being collected through centralized channels of data collection. And this is real choice behavior across lots of different contexts, different places, different countries, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And they're looking for patterns from commercial points of view, but it's not hard to see that in 20 or 30 years, if the data is liberated, that social scientists will be in a very different position. There'll be very just different types of problems than the problems that we see today. Likewise, with these machines we carry around us, these cell phones, I mean, they track where we go. There's a huge amount of information that's suddenly available. This doesn't seem to be slowing down. It doesn't seem that we've hit a point now where people are deciding to go off the grid, not use email, not have their phone with them. It could happen, but I think that's unlikely. We're just seeing the acceleration again of collection of huge amounts of information, and that's in some ways very deep, but it's also longitudinal, which is great for the social scientist. So you can actually track individuals and how their behavior changes over time. And in some cases in real time. As an example of this, I just put up a simplistic example. A team out at Stanford, Camphor and Harris, you might know this work. Can't really see it here for some reason. Sorry about that. Shows up on my screen well though. Actually can look at people in terms of their age groups and their gender and the weather and all sorts of things, and just see what kind of words they're using, how they're feeling, and that gives a sense of mood across millions and millions of people, tens of millions of people. And then you can sort of map that in different parts of the different areas, localities, towns, to see how moods change and how information affects people. Again, proxy measures, very, very undeveloped at this stage or early on, but you can see where the potential's going here for projects that might be, for instance, political science. If you want to look at the effects of a new policy or voting behavior or all sorts of things. There's just a new realm out there. So, from my perspective, the question isn't really around big data. I mean, that's sort of a lot of hype in my opinion, all that. But it's around big methods, ways to apprehend and create new realities out of a new baseline that's evolving in society and for the social sciences. Data, at least in my days of collecting data, that is really the scarce commodity, and it was expensive to collect. It took a long time and so forth, and that's no longer the case. Now we're having billions of pathways constantly being mapped that are connected with real behavior in real time. So we're seeing a sort of an inversion here, where different fields have a situation where there's too much information, and we have to look for ways, the opportunities. If we're looking forward to the future of the social sciences, to a large extent has to do with the new opportunities that are arising and how well we can apprehend those opportunities. So I think actually there's a lot more change on the horizon in the next few decades than we've seen for a while, and that's very exciting. And if I had to speculate a little bit on this, I think that not only the methods themselves, but also looking at ways to measure things and represent information that the human mind isn't designed to represent. And so we can use different types of tools to help us with that. How are we doing on time here? So I want to just say something that overlaps a little bit more into the type of work that I do on a sort of a day-by-day basis, which is the looking at creating new pathways for new projects in the context of some of the broader activity that I'm talking about here. The first has to do with the prospects for the first time, I think, in a rigorous way of mapping and modeling contexts, the context of a choice, the context of a behavior, the complex interplay of a lot of different free parameters at once has always been very difficult because of intractability problems. My guess is that some of that intractability is going to start going away, and it's going to go away in the same way that science progresses across the board, which is that it's going to be easier, and it is easier right now, to actually describe certain things that are happening, to have a description based on more information. And once you have that description, then you can start to look for patterns, regularities, create theoretical constructs that can then be tested. And the minute you have theories that are better than random predictions, you're on the pathway to ever greater increases in refinement of those theories, and they're setting things up for progress. So that's exciting and new space. Likewise, I'm looking a lot at the complex relationships, interreactions, just not unidirectional activities, but how relationships co-evolve over time. And so the work I do in the game theory and the evolutionary dynamics area in biology is in this area. How pathways diverge, evolve, get cut off. That's a lot easier now, that work. And I know that the theoretical models that I work with in that area are still very simplistic, and I don't think they're going to stay that way for much longer. I think we're going to see a lot of innovation there. Another area that's not particularly mapped out too well are complex causal pathways. And I've been meeting with some of the leading scholars in this area, actually. And there's agreement that complex causality is it's a tough area. But with the changes in what information we have and the computational power to look at that information, I do think it's going to become a lot less mysterious, and that has implications for all the social scientists. And then finally, the dynamic systems and flows within systems is an area that I'm looking at right now. I think has a lot of potential for modeling and moving into the more theoretical space in the different social sciences. So it's almost like we're awash in opportunity out there. And I do wonder whether the techniques that we have, which have been perfected over decades under different conditions, are going to suffice for the new types of challenges. My guess is that they won't, that new techniques are needed. And one of the things that is possible is that the need for the techniques will be driven by external factors and external forces. So we're already seeing that a little bit, I think, in the space where companies are using this information for commercial purposes. And I think that's going to drive more demand for people who have social science expertise and others who have modeling expertise in physics and biology. We already see a lot of that. But as social scientists, I think that we want to keep this in mind as we're thinking about our students and the pathways for the students, what that opening opportunity looks like and what those shifts look like. And then I guess an area for concern that I have is that a lot of the information that's being collected now that pertains to the social sciences, it's not being collected by scholars so much anymore directly. A lot of it's being directed through commercial interests or government interests. It's really important as social sciences to try to have access to that, make sure there's access for that data and that information. Otherwise, the fields I think can't progress as much as they could, and there could even be an eclipse of academic research by applied research in the same way we've seen in some other fields. And so that's, I think, something to be vigilant for. So those are some ideas about the future directions, and let's have a discussion and debate if possible. Anyone? Well, okay, let's go on. So, sure.
As a historian, I think of other moments in which people were making predictions about the future of the social sciences. If you think about the 1960s and the idea of systems and how it is that people had the idea that you could even map systems worldwide. Or you could go down to the level of cities, that if we understood the inputs and the outputs and the flows and so on, we could begin to manipulate social processes. There have been other moments as well where there's been a lot of excitement, right, about the future of the social sciences. So I wonder if it'd be worth, as part of the discussion, to reflect on what we got right and what we got wrong in trying to predict the ways in which access to new kinds of data, the potential for new types of analysis, including computational analysis, which was also a factor in the 60s, how it is that we, in some cases, made good predictions, and how in other ways history turned out differently. So that could be an interesting thing to talk about.
It's also scale dependent. And one of my first projects when I left the academy was to look at, we want to know how we could, how future predictions of trends have failed throughout the ages. So we looked at 500 years of everything that was written, that we could find that was written on this. And in the short term, the best predictor of the future is things stay the same. Things next year will be like they are this year. But in the longer term, things like, early, you mentioned in work in the 60s, so artificial intelligence was very big in the 60s, and it didn't peak, and it went through a sort of a period of decline in the 70s and 80s. But then a lot of those ideas actually re-emerged in the 90s under different forms, and quite a few of the ideas that were being dreamt about in the 60s kind of got tossed out, but by the 1990s, they had become reality with the increase of computers and other things like that. So that's really valuable and interesting.
One reason I think about that quite a lot is that the 60s, that was a time in which there was a brave future for cliometrics, that history was going to become a computational discipline. And some of the early work that was done actually discredited that whole idea, and it made it much harder for others who wanted to advance quantitative methods within history. So it's also, important to have some, humility in the kind of claims that we want to make and the way that can impact the way those ideas are received or rejected.
One thing that's pretty sure is that things do change. And, probably 100 years from now, things won't be like they are today in some ways, even though they might be very similar a year from now than it is today. So yeah, being humble is important. I agree. But a lot of times change starts with imagination too. So it's a complicated interplay.
One of the things, presumably a reason we're having this meeting is that we think there are serious impediments to change. I mean, why don't we just let everything take care of itself, given everything you said about changing forms of data and so forth? Well, I think most of us would agree that the academic departmentalization and received frameworks that we teach to our students probably constitute one of the biggest impediments to moving forward. And so one of the things I would like to put on the table is to think about how academic institutions can try to change the incentives, actually, within the social sciences and encourage more of this exploratory, frontier, interdisciplinary work. I think this is going to be a big challenge, not just for us, but for people who run universities and fund them. I could elaborate, but...
There's a hand. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. General question first. So we're waiting till the end to ask questions. We're not interjecting. No Chicago rules here in terms of when we're asking questions.
Yeah, during the presentation.
Okay, good. So following up on that point, I also believe that there are institutional constraints to change of the sort that you're suggesting. I agree that the science can and should and will move toward more real-time dynamic concerns, big data questions, and so on. But I also believe that as a sociologist, many of the journals, for example, the process of publishing this work is a process that is institutionally constrained in very important ways. Many very prominent papers take 2 to 3 years to publish, for example, in the American Journal of Sociology or American Sociological Review, and go through 2 or 3 rounds of review. And that seems, in some ways, counterintuitive when we know and we believe that we should be moving toward a real-time understanding of social reality. Do you have a sense of how we can deal with that, or should we be moving more toward a internet-based review process, or a process that doesn't require more than one review, or anything else that can circumvent this kind of institutional constraint to immediate social?
That will continue, and to the extent that it does, the social scientists who are involved in it will become increasingly irrelevant. That's my perspective. And so it's a dynamic that you see in many areas, even in biology or others, where people stuck to older conventions. And I think in today's world, communication is really important within peer groups. And the best people in the field always know what others are doing. It's always that way. And they know when a result is good. And the publication is usually a formality and almost an affirmation of something that's happened, and it's a second order sort of thing. So, but ultimately, the information itself needs to, it's instantiated in journals, which gives us certain legitimacy, but the speed is likely to render a lot of that work irrelevant by the time it's published, right? Because it's coming out so far. If it's coming out 2 years later, 3 years later, it's like putting something in an archive more than being part of an ongoing discussion, which is happening on email and in our meetings with colleagues and those sorts of things. Yeah.
Can I?
It's my opinion. It's just an opinion.
I actually strongly disagree. I think, but I'll speak within the field of economics, which mercifully doesn't have too many representatives here. Increasingly, people do not recognize a good new idea. They have trouble doing exactly what you said should be,
Right.
but it isn't. They will look at papers and they will not know how to evaluate them. What happens as a result is that the publication in a top journal becomes the affirmation.
A signal.
That's the signal. Everybody
Right.
talks about signaling, and they don't talk about the content. So I think what's happening, in fact, is that there's great difficulty recognizing when an idea is good, especially a new idea. And so people fall back on this signaling story as a sort of a cop-out. And this has gotten, in my view, much worse over the last several decades within economics, so that now people cannot get tenure at any reasonable institution unless they, quote, have a top 5 or maybe several top 5 publications. Well, the very use of the term top 5 is a giveaway here. They're not talking about the content of the article.
Right. No, absolutely.
Yeah, if I
one or two more. And then we...
Yeah, I want to just jump in on that point. Earlier, what you said, Barnaby, was that we need to break down disciplinary boundaries and talk to one another, and yet what you just said was that all the insiders already know the result before it's published, but that is the siloing, which is subdisciplinarity, and if we're going to get broader and communicate between sociologists and economists, where else am I going to look but the QJE or JPE or someplace? I have to have access to that stuff. I'm not in that club. And so if I'm going to know what's going on in the field, I need to have somebody vet. I can't read everything on the MBER website.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.